And welcome back to Movie Conversations. I'm Brian Ritchie. Joining me as always is Nora St. John. Good morning, Nora. How's things on your side of the earth this morning?
They're just delightful, Brian. And just so y'all know, I am about to head to Brian's neck of the woods, Washington,
Yeah.
D.C. area tomorrow. And we're going to be doing some filming for some video on demand stuff about the lower back. So
Yeah.
keep an eye out for that. It'll be a while, just a warning. But just so you know, like what we're doing.
Exactly. Well, this won't be posted for a few weeks anyway. So, figure this summer sometime we'll have an announcement. Putting together a nice little video series that should, enlighten and enhance what you already know and go into further detail than probably you thought we would. So this is good. I like this.
Exactly. Gonna have some fun. So yeah. And how are you doing, Brian?
I'm doing good. Yeah. Everything on this side of the world is doing pretty good. Feel like a little overwhelmed. I'm looking at the rest of my year and it's starting to fill up a lot more than at the beginning of the year, you're looking at a blank calendar.
Yeah.
And nothing's filled in yet. And occasionally
Uh-huh.
you'll write in someone's birthday, or you might write in something here or there. Now I'm looking at my list and I'm like, wow, okay, yeah, we've got a lot going on. This is great. But wow, there's a lot going on. So I think just it's starting to dawn on me how much is actually going on, which is fabulous. I love it. But it's just one of those things like, oh, wow, yeah, okay. You and I are traveling a lot this year and going to get out there and teach a lot of people. So this is going to be a lot of fun.
Awesome. Exactly. And guys, we'll start to put our schedule out and get you all more information as we go forward, because we're starting to really roll into the future, which is not just Moving Conversations podcast, but also live events for both of us individually and together. And we're moving forward. So it's a very exciting time.
Yeah. Well, today,
you and I have talked about,
you and I have talked about doing this one for a while because, and our topic is going to be research, how to read research. Where do we find it? How do we decipher it? How are you supposed to read it? Both of us, I think, we're very similar on how we do it. So I thought it'd be a nice way to come out and, do it. Because how many times have you had a client or a colleague or a student come up to you and say, I read this one article.
Mm-hmm.
Or you'll read something from a newspaper article or something, especially some of the, let's just say, not often the New York Times or one of the larger ones, but often one of the smaller ones. And the entire article is based on a single study. And it's sort of like, okay, maybe it's time for us to go into a little bit of detail on how do we read research? How do we, pick and choose what we're to believe?
And one of the things that Brian and I always focus on, and I think you know this if you've been listening to any of these podcasts with us, is this idea of just movement science. What does the science say as best as we can determine? And one of the things that I like to mention when we start to talk about research is research follows experience, right? I'm going to say that again. Research follows experience.
Yep.
And the reason that I say that is because there's a big push, and appropriately in many certain circumstances, for research-based or evidence-based treatments or protocols or that kind of thing. Well, that's fine when there is such a thing.
Mm-hmm.
But very often, a lot of what we do is there's no research about it. There's not good research about it. There's not really, and we're often out there on the edge trying to figure something out for a particular client with a particular situation. And just, to remember that the most important thing often is you with that client having an effective relationship with them, right? And making things change. And research can be helpful in that and supportive of that, but it is not a substitute for that, right? It's really your experience with that client that is going to give you a lot of the information that you need to work with that client. So I just want to remind us of that before we go into the airy fairy land of research.
And I think you and I are both, a long time ago, when I was a baby trainer, working under my mom, and she kept telling me, really get in tune with my intuition. What do you feel? What do you feel? What do you feel? And you don't have that when you're first starting out. You really don't. You have to learn based on all the experience. And now over 30 years of experience, I've got a ton of intuition. And there's times when someone say, where did that come from? I have no idea. It's
Exactly.
just, it came out of my mouth before I even realized what I was saying, and we're trying
Mhm.
something different. And that experience can't be bought. It can't be paid for. And it can't be written about because it's something that you and I have cultivated over many, 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 many years of seeing clients face to face, one on one, and really being in the trenches. And I
Yeah.
find that research is great, but it's a snapshot of a certain population.
Yep.
And I mean, when we see the best studies, often have, they talk about double blind placebos and things. You can't do that with human beings
Not
because
with movement. It's
not with
complex.
movement. No, you can do it with
Mm-mm.
certain things, but with movement, it's very challenging because either you
Mhm.
moved or you didn't. Either you
Yeah.
did a protocol or you didn't.
Yeah.
So it's very challenging because if you do it and I do it, we're probably going to get slightly different results because we're not of the same gender,
Mhm.
we're slightly
Mhm.
different age, you
Mhm.
know, I'm built way differently than you are. I've got pre-existing conditions, you've got pre-existing conditions. So when it breaks it all down, we're different people. So we
Yeah.
can't be wedged into, the black and white sometimes that research does. So just keep that in mind, that sometimes research wants to be black and white, and there's a whole lot of gray when it comes to research.
Yes. Absolutely. And one thing that I want to add to that, these are our kind of caveats before we talk a little more about this, is I'm going to use an analogy here. So the human body is complex and they're very different, right? They've discovered that in many, many, many ways, that when they're giving, for example, a drug and they're in drug trials with people, well, 60% of the people respond well to it, 20% doesn't do much, another 20% have a negative reaction.
Yep.
So it's not just the drug itself and all human beings, it's that particular physiology, et cetera. So there's an individualization always. That's
Yep.
part of the problem. And in terms of movement, that gets more complex because typically you're not looking at one joint doing one thing or one muscle doing one thing. And research is very, very good at small questions, at answering
Mm-hmm.
small questions. How does the patella move in the patellar groove? Right? It can kind of answer that. What does the quadricep do when you straighten the knee? It can answer that. But can it answer what is the best movement protocol for strengthening the whole support system around the knee so that it doesn't hurt anymore? That's a
Mm-hmm.
much bigger question, and it doesn't have so precise an answer.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So that's one of the biggest thing about movement science-based research or research in our field of movement is you're always trying to define a question specifically enough so you can answer it,
Right.
but not so specific that it's actually meaningless,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that's just a challenge with research on movement is
Yeah.
trying to walk that line of something that's useful, um, but not again so fine tuned or fine granular that it's not really important or valuable.
Something also to think about, us compared to researchers,
Yeah.
very, very different
Hmm.
people. Okay. If you think of when I mentioned in the trenches, if you think of us like the soldiers, we're on the field, we're the ones working with the clients, we're the ones really doing all of the work. Well, the researchers are the ones in the office. They're the intelligence,
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
community.
Yeah.
They're working on a theoretical basis on a lot of this. And when you work
Yes.
on theory, it's different than when you work with people. And
Yeah.
their mindset is very different than ours is. Whereas
Hmm.
for us, it's about whole body movement. Sometimes it's about, okay, what joint supports that joint, etc. They want to break it down into what can they prove. So
Hmm.
they're going to break it down as small as they can and lock it into as tight of a parameter as they possibly can and draw the line around it. That's what we're studying. Whereas
Yep.
for us, if you're just doing the knee, okay, great. But how does it affect the hip, the ankle, the foot, and everything else involved? And if you're not taking all those other things into account, what's going on too? So there's a lot going on that they're not taking into account.
Exactly.
So just
And
something to think about.
so when we read research, there's a couple things. First of all, is where am I finding the research?
Right.
Right? Where am I? What am I looking? What do I find? typically in this day and age, we go on the interweb, right?
Yes.
And we look for something, and we put in patellofemoral dysfunction, for example, right? For some reason, I'm on the knees today,
That's
but
okay.
put in something like that, and I'm basically looking for information on that. And for you guys, if you're out there and you're either a client or you're a professional, oftentimes some client comes in with a question, you're like, I don't even know what that is. So let me look it up and
Yeah.
at least figure out what body parts involved and what that means. So when you look on the web, you'll find a lot of things. A lot of times you'll find the first things that come up are typically things like Healthline, WebMD,
Sponsored a
Mayo
lot.
Clinic. Right, exactly. And you make it a bunch of garbage that's just like, here's a strap that you can use to fix your knee, or here's 27 products we can sell you, right? So some of it first is just being able to identify what is maybe useful and what is not useful in that first tranche, right? And oftentimes something like Mayo Clinic I go to a lot. That's one that I find is useful. Other ones sometimes we'll just have a basic introduction to what is the thing, what is the pathology, what are the common treatments that you give, and just like in a very basic way.
Yep.
And so those are often like times a nice place to start. But let's say I want to go, well, what might be the best way for a movement professional to treat somebody with patellofemoral dysfunction? Right. So I'm kind of looking at physical therapy for patellofemoral dysfunction, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And then things suddenly get way more complicated pretty quickly. Yeah. So then you're going to come up with a lot of things. And some of those are going to be things like Physiopedia, which is not that great a website, or Wikipedia will sometimes show up. I don't find particularly Physiopedia to be, it seems like a bunch of different people have written a bunch of different articles, and they're very variable in terms of everything. And then you'll find actual research articles. Typically, like I'm looking for things from PubMed. I'm looking for things from National Institutes of Health, NIH. There's a couple of things I sometimes find. Stat Pearls is oftentimes a good summary of an issue or a situation or a surgery or a condition. So those are a bunch of things that I kind of go to. PubMed's great because a lot of times there's a lot of articles that are free. Yeah, and you can just search it. And then once I find an article that I like or that is telling me what I want to know, then I also look at the references at the bottom of that article, and then I may dive deeper into those.
The places that I often will go that I trust are going to be Cleveland Clinic, Mayo Clinic. Because oftentimes, if I typed in patellofemoral dysfunction or patellofemoral syndrome, for instance, and you can see the first ones that come up are going to be Healthline, and they're going to be things that are just so generalized. And often I tell this to my son all the time, because he always says, oh, I saw something on the internet. And I would say, okay, the person who wrote it, chances are that's their opinion. Okay, if I wrote something on the internet, it'd be based on my experience and my opinion. Now, a lot of people who are writing it are paid to write it, and they're young, and they may not have the same experience that you and I do, or a physician or a physical therapist might.
Well, they're often a journalist, right?
Or
who's just been told to write an article on X. So they're doing the same research we're doing, wandering through the internet and trying to get some information to throw out there.
Exactly. So a lot of times I will, disregard all of those and go for someone like, Mayo Clinic, and then I'll click on that, but I'll also look who wrote it. Often you'll see a couple, 2, 3, 4 physicians will have contributed.
And also often say like reviewed, like 2024, right? I'll say reviewed. I often say the review date on it, which is really useful for, especially for things that are moving quickly. Like I think about, we talked about in terms of weight loss drugs. I'm really looking at like, what is the newest information on that? Because that is moving fast. And I kind of want more current information on that.
And I also appreciate if you get it from certain places like Mayo Clinic, Cleveland Clinic, when you go down to the end of the article, what's nice about it is the article is often written in plainer language than if you went to PubMed. There are times I've been reading research for most of my adult life, and there are times I'll read the same paragraph 4 times and be like, I have no idea what the heck he's talking about. Or they'll say,
you're going to translate every word.
Or they'll give you initials and you'll be like, RT. Where was that before? I never saw that. And you're scrolling, and the one mention of it, you're like, doggone it, I totally missed that. But if it's written in more plain language, it's good. And then at the end of the article, they'll often cite where they got their, their citations and their research, which is nice. And there won't be 300, there might be
Yeah.
5. And
Yeah.
that's a good place to start because you're reading
Mhm.
it in plain language. It usually puts it into a context that we can discuss
Yeah.
or at least understand as the lay population, because let's face it, a lot of people are more lay population than, movement professionals for the past, several decades.
Yeah.
And so that's a good place to start. And then you can dive into the research itself.
Now, one of the things that I wanted to just mention here was when I go to find research. Okay, so like why do I care? Um, Very much if whatever your particular background is, whether you're a client or whether you're a professional, if you're a movement professional, you've had some training, right? And a lot of times that training has distilled certain amounts, certain kinds of movement science research into a perspective or a technique or a method that you can then use, right? So a
Mm-hmm.
lot of times there is a lot of research behind what you do and what you've been taught, and you just don't know what it is. So just know that a lot of any reputable program will have a lot of that in its background. When I'm going to find research, it's when there's something new, like for example, fascia is something that I've done a lot of reading on and researching about because it's a new, it's evolving field, and I'm trying to figure it out.
Yep.
So yes, there's something like Anatomy Trains, which has taken a lot of that research and distilled it in a really beautiful way. Or there's other resources as well. I know Robert Schleip has some really wonderful books that have distilled some of that research. But sometimes I want to know, like, where did they get that from? Like,
Right.
where did that particular thing come from?
Yep.
And I'm going to use an example from Pilates. Um, in Pilates, there's and actually in osteoporosis. I'm talking about osteoporosis in Pilates, right? There's a lot of research that says that if you have loaded flexion, especially with rotation, you are more likely to fracture the spine, which kind of makes sense if you think about it,
Mm-hmm.
right? If there's osteoporosis in play. Well, when you look into that and you look into the research for that, you discover that that's based on a relatively small study, like 40 people that
Mm.
they followed over a period of time. And they discovered that when people did loaded rotation, they were more, loaded flexion and rotation, they were more likely to fracture than if they did, say, extension. And so it's kind of like, okay, well, that's interesting. And there's some truth in that. People definitely could fracture that way. But it's also like, that's a small sample size. And so a lot of times when I'm looking at research, I'm looking at sample size. Like, is this 20 people? Is this 40 people? A lot of research is done by graduate students in a
Yep.
physical therapy program or a kinesiology program or a sports science program. And they basically oftentimes recruit their buddies who are all in their 20s as clients or
Yep.
research subjects, because that's who they have access to, and they get 14 of them or they get 25 of them, and that's what they base their research on.
Yep.
So if you are reading research, really look at what are the demographics. Do they match your demographics of who you're thinking about in terms of why you're reading this research? And was the sample size big enough to really be useful? One other study I was reading was about power plates and vibration training, and it was for osteoporosis. And it was like, okay, so the sample size was under 30, and a quarter of the sample dropped out after the first session because it was so uncomfortable.
Yeah.
So I'm like, okay. In my opinion, that's meaningless research. That doesn't tell me anything. Like, whatever things they saw in those remaining 24 people, I have no idea if there's any validity there. So sometimes, looking at the demographics, looking at the number of participants, those are things that I often look at when I'm looking at research to see whether it makes sense, right? Whether it's a big enough
Absolutely.
sample size to actually have any validity.
Yeah. If the sample size is too small, and the thing that, yeah, if it's too small, you're not going to see a good snapshot of, you know, general society demographics. When I was at the University of Hawaii, I did a lot of research with my professor because I was basically the grunt. I liked working with people, and he liked writing, so we made a good
Uh,
team.
yeah.
So I would do all the sampling, and what I found was he kept saying, okay, we're only going to do, I want you to focus on females. And he said, wow, we're getting, because I went to the University of Hawaii, it's like, there's a lot of Asian. Well, that's another study we can write, is female Asian. Okay, so he would dissect the demographic and thought, oh, we can easily do 6 or 7 papers out of this.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking, based on each demographic.
Splitting up the demographic.
Right. And the more you split it up, well, the smaller the sample size got.
Right.
And for us, it was looking at maximum exertion tests. And so for us, it was very clear, it was a very clear, easy test. However, for a lot of these things, how can someone, say, here's a brand new methodology of stretching, for instance, and it's unbelievably awesome. We did it on 16-year-old football players. It's going to work for your senior citizens.
Right, exactly.
So demographics as well as methodology, I find, because what were their methods?
Yep.
How often did they have to do this? Did they have to, whatever the protocol is, reason I bring this up is there's something about, and this is something that's been touted, I can't tell you how long, but it has been out there, that training children under the age of 13 will stunt their growth. You cannot
training them
lift
in terms
weights.
Of resistance training.
Resistance training.
Specifically, right? Yeah.
One study done way long ago, and my professor is the one that brought it up to me. He showed us the study, and we looked at it. It had the worst methodology you could ever imagine. It was totally non-existent, but it gets published in one major newspaper. And like the game telephone, the next person, the next person, the next person, by the time it's told the 20th person, suddenly it's become scripture.
Right.
And, would I rather use body weight on my kids? Absolutely. But look, in real life, they're going to have to lift heavy things and move them around.
Seriously.
That's the way it is.
Like groceries, your little brother, right. Absolutely.
So just common sense tells you, how many.
That doesn't make any sense.
Well, I'm reminded of a strength conditioning coach, is a good friend of mine, who said some of the strongest people he ever met were what he called farm strong.
Yeah.
They were tall, they were burly, yep. They worked on the farm, and they were strong, but they were lifting and hauling and moving. They were weightlifting from the time they were 3 years old, 4 years old, and they could be out in the field helping dad, helping the brothers.
Exactly.
So just common sense told me that didn't make it, that study was bogus.
Wrong. Yep.
But again, the methodologies, you have to look at that. You have to dissect that. Does it make sense?
So one of the things that happens a lot, to your point, in Pilates, and I've seen this many times, I've read many studies, Pilates studies, and it's like, this is the people, they did a Pilates program.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what they'll say in terms of the program that they did. Like, it won't say like they did this exercise and this exercise. It won't be specific about what was actually done. And so you're kind of like, all right, that's like saying they moved. Because, Pilates has 500 exercises and a million ways to do things. And so it's absolutely meaningless at that point.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're not going to tell me from a movement science perspective, right? If you're not going to tell me what movements you actually did, then this study becomes meaningless at that moment, because I don't know what you did. And if I don't know what you did, I couldn't replicate it. And if I can't replicate it, then that study doesn't mean anything. Right. So, right. So methodology, right. Does it tell you what they did? And especially from a movement perspective, did they tell you what the moves were that they did, or what resistance they used, or what equipment they used, or how many reps they did, or how they progressed it? Like, that kind of specificity is kind of critical if you're actually going to have faith in that particular study. So there's one thing, that methodology piece is what they do. Did it make sense?
In physical therapy, I see in those studies all the time. We did a knee strengthening routine.
Right.
Was it straight leg raises? Was it a leg extension machine? Was it on the reformer? Was it squats? There are 1,000 exercises for the knee.
Yep.
How many repetitions, how many sets, how often, frequency, intensity, all of these variables that weren't You know, it just said they did that compared to a group that didn't. Well, guess what? They got stronger.
They did something. Right,
Karnak,
you do
I could have guessed that. I
right,
could have
you do
predicted
something
it.
versus doing nothing, probably something's gonna get better. But for me to replicate that, like, what does that mean for me to replicate that?
Right,
Like, if I'm reading that and I'm trying to figure out how to make my client's knee stronger,
right,
that didn't tell me how to do that. That just
right.
told me that they did something, and then
And
I've
if
gotta,
you
like,
have
make that
different,
up.
yeah, and if you have different people who are teaching it, let's say for Pilates, let's say they
Right.
do list 5 or 6 exercises. Are they being watched? How were they coached? Are they being coached at the time? All of these, all of these things will, and if you're a personal trainer or a Pilates instructor out there, you know, if you tell someone, here's 3 exercises, go do them on their own, versus if you're
Mhm.
standing over them, guiding them and cueing them
It's a
correctly, you're going to
different
get different
experience.
results.
Yes, absolutely.
So, you know, when we did a lot of our research, I made sure I took all the body fat and measurements. Why? Because I had done over 10,000 by that point. And I knew that they were always going to be to me. Whereas if I had 4 or 5 other people doing all of the measurements, including, you know, skin fold caliper, guess what? They're going to have some variability just from the person doing it, the
And
user.
and and that's called inter-rater reliability,
Yes.
that particular thing. And so again, if you're doing all of the tests, you're using your reference. Right? Like you know how you use the tools, you know what you call half an inch versus whatever, right? You
Exactly.
know how you measure it, you know, and you've got the same eyes looking at the same data. So data is
Yep.
more likely to be similar, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's just, these are just some of the things when you're reading it. You have to read it with a, I hate to use the word skeptical eye, but you have to be with a
You have to be
judgmental eye.
critical. You have
Critical.
to be
That's the word
critical.
I'm looking for.
You have to be critical.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And something I'm going to say, and we touched on this a little bit, when you're reading it, you're going to see the little marks 1, 2, 3, 17, 23. If something either doesn't make sense,
Mhm.
makes you question, or is like, wow, that's a really big statement, look at where it came from and go
Mhm.
and read that study.
Yeah.
Because you and I have both written, you've written a heck of a lot more than I have when it comes to technical uh, things, when it comes to certifications, but I've written some of those and I've written a book. It's real easy to take an article and take a little piece of this and take a little piece of that and skew the data a little bit to say what you want it to say. You,
Absolutely.
and you know, authors do this.
Absolutely, we all do. Whether we do it consciously or unconsciously, right?
Exactly.
Bias happens both ways. Either you're trying to tell a story and you choose your data to tell that story, or your unconscious perspective on something will allow you to just like shape it in this particular way, right? That happens all the time.
Exactly. And that's something that I always, my thing is this: if I take a class or if I read an article, I read it. I'm like, okay, did it make sense? Did their outcome make sense to me just on a common sense perspective?
Right.
And if it's no, then I'm like, okay, either it's bogus or I missed something. So I'm going to reread it. Then I'm going to go back and say, okay, where did they get their facts from?
Yep.
Okay, then I'm going to read through those. And where did they get their facts from? And then I'm going to read through those. And it's
Hmm.
going to lead you down this wormhole. You know, when
Hmm.
you have these, you know, people have a tendency to do this with Instagram, you know, they just scroll for days. Well, you can do this with research. You can keep digging deeper and deeper and deeper into these wells of knowledge. But it's the only way to really see what the author was really trying to get at, because they
Yeah.
could have picked this one cherry, we call it cherry picking, cherry
Yeah.
picked this one piece of data from this one, you know, study
Yep.
and made their whole study based on that.
Yep.
But did they really read that whole study?
And
So
to your point, I
yeah,
loved your idea about um, the kids that shouldn't do any weightlifting under 13, right? Again, it's like it's also, does it pass the common sense test?
exactly.
Right? Because some things just don't pass the common sense test. Or like I remember an article, a research article that was all about how when women wear high heels, over time their Achilles tendon gets shorter. Shocking, shocking. Like, who can imagine such a thing? So in that case, it was just banal. It's like, duh. If you're going to put your foot in a particular position, your body in a particular position for extended periods of time and not do anything to change those ranges of motion, those muscles are going to shorten up and tighten up, and you're going to lose some range of motion. Like, so there's banality, right? Which is
Yeah.
sometimes it, or in your case, it's like, this just doesn't make any sense.
Right.
Like, how can you expect a 13-year-old never to have lifted anything, especially a 13?
Right.
I mean, 8-year-olds have less strength. 13-year-olds, I don't know, man. I was practically full grown at 13. I was physically capable of most things I'm capable of now, if not more so.
Yeah. I take both my boys to the gym with me, and 16-year-old and 13-year-old. Well, guess what? The 13-year-old, we're lifting weights. We're doing things. We're a lot of body weight exercises, a lot of what I call loaded movement. Lift this up, move this over here, squat this over here. Do I put a heavy bar on his back? No, but then again, I don't need to. There's 1,001 different ways to exercise somebody.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I know that there are strength and conditioning coaches out there working with kids as young as 8 and 9 years old, doing major lifts, and these kids are getting stronger. And guess what? They're still growing. So again, you're like you said, does it pass the common sense test? Does it just make sense? If it doesn't, then, move on. Right.
So this isn't one of our bigger, deeper topics, I don't think. We just wanted to bring it up because so many things that I find in the newspaper, for example, or even honestly going through Pilates for the last 30 plus years, there have been entire universes built on one study.
Yes.
To put it bluntly, right? Like, somebody hears something like, I remember at one point somebody said, we should never do internal rotation on your hips because that's where you're most likely to get arthritis. So that if you do, it's one of those random things that I heard. Wow. Somebody was like going on this whole topic for a while, like, so never do internal rotation because you'll wear out the inside of your hip and you'll be more likely to get arthritis. I'm like, okay, if I'm training a golfer, I have no option but to do some internal rotation, right? Like, that's going to be kind of critical for their sport. Or, if I'm playing a soccer player, this is not going to work. So there was a lack of common sense about that. But then it was also looking at a little bit at also how science moves forward, because in that case, this was a long time ago that I was reading this. And at that point, yes, one of the most common areas of arthritis was in that kind of inside part of the acetabulum. So that's just a pretty common area for osteophytes to grow. But also turns out that arthritis, and this was a newer development of arthritis, isn't just a wear and tear situation. It also can be an underuse situation. So if you never use that range of motion, then those osteophytes can grow unhindered by you not stimulating that part of the joint and smoothing it out with regular internal rotation.
Makes sense.
Right. So it's also one of those things where that was a certain perspective of arthritis happens because of wear and tear, so don't wear and tear that part. And it turned out, well, yes, there's some truth in that, but there's also truth in the fact that arthritis can also come from lack of use, not just overuse. And so if you're not actually moving that area, you're not actually wearing out those osteophytes, or you're just keeping that area stimulated in a positive way to not grow those osteophytes. So that's also that like research changes and perspectives on things change. And that's also why it's useful to question your assumptions, question the things you think you know every now and then, and just go back and dive in and go, is this still true? Are the facts that I learned 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago still really relevant?
Something else to think about, just because something hasn't been proven yet doesn't mean it's not true.
Absolutely.
And that's something that I think we sometimes get hung up on when we think about data. Well, where's your data? What study? Well, look, not everything can be proven and not everything has been studied yet. And so also keep that in mind. That's when our experience, our own personal experiences come into play, and why on 99% of the clients, these exercises work the best, but on that 1%, the contraindicated exercise actually seems to work better. Why is that?
Right.
So just because it hasn't been proven yet, remember, hypothesis may lead to data.
Hmm.
You know, there's tons of hypotheses out there, and we're coming up with new ones all the time. So just because it hasn't been proven doesn't mean it's not true. You know, but also don't get hung up on it and say, oh, well, my belief is this, because we've all taken classes where we're listening to the person like, you're basing this whole class on 3 clients.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. It doesn't seem like the best choice.
Probably not.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. That's a good point, right? That you want to make sure that what you're doing doesn't always like that's kind of where I started really, which is that experience leads research.
Yeah.
You know, experience, it's like when you work with enough clients for enough periods of time, you start to have those, they can call it intuition. I almost call it just organized data in my brain.
Oh, yeah.
That may be not the right way to think about it, but there's, intuition always sounds like magic.
Oh, good point.
Right. It's not magic. It's just that you've seen these movement patterns enough times on enough bodies to know that if you just change this or give them this cue, for most people that seems to make a difference. So you just pull that from your data bank and use
Mm-hmm.
that, and oftentimes without
Mm-hmm.
realizing that you even know that, right? It just
Right.
pops out. And that's really where paying attention when you're training comes through. One other thing I'll say again to reiterate what Brian said in a slightly different way is, and again, a reminder too, the body is very complex. The interactions
Mm-hmm.
in the body are very hard to study because there's so many things happening at any given time. And one of the examples I use on that is my husband Al, who some of you know, but my husband Al was a engineer at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratories in California out here. And they have had at that point one of the most powerful supercomputers on the planet. And what they were trying to do, they're doing all kinds of nasty things with it, like studying, nuclear fusion and all that kind of stuff. But the other thing they were trying to do was model in real time all of the chemical interactions and reactions within one cell. Okay. I mean, that was just one of the things they were trying to do to see if they could actually do that. This is the most powerful supercomputer on the planet with some of the smartest brains, on the planet as well. And they couldn't model that in real time. So you take that and you multiply that times a human body, right?
Right.
All the many, many cells and different kinds of cells, and you kind of realize the challenge that we're up against, that
Mm-hmm.
that the human body is a very complex integrated system with the neurological system and the myofascial system and the brain and the personality and the experience and the psychology, like all those bits come together to create that experience for that client. And research can give you, again, some data and some useful stuff, but there's all that other piece, like the art and the science, right? There's the
Right.
science, and then there's the art, which we build on top of that science,
Mm-hmm.
hopefully responsibly.
Yeah. One other thing to think about when there's studies that are, there's a company I was working for and I was developing their education. And I got into the portion about flexibility. Well, I had a stack of papers, probably 12 inches high, printed out, that proved one thing. I had
Mhm.
another stack about 12 inches high that proved the exact opposite.
Exactly.
And I read through them and I said, what are you going to do? Because
Exactly.
truthfully, a bunch of things said, no matter what you do, you're never changing flexibility. I was like, but I know better. My personal
I've
experience,
experienced it many times with many
yeah,
clients and with myself. Yeah.
with myself, with my own body,
Yeah.
with, and
Absolutely.
I'm thinking, obviously it works, even though these studies say it doesn't. And then other studies that are, touting huge, gigantic annual theme. I don't know if that, so again, critical eye,
Hmm.
does it make sense to you? That's the thing I always come down to. And I mention it to my staff and to my students. It's like, does it make sense to you? And if it doesn't, do more digging until something does seem to make sense and correspond with what you're either thinking, or does it change the way you're thinking? Because, okay, now, yes, I get it. This makes sense to me. Because we've all
Right.
been there too, where we'll be thinking one thing and, oh my gosh, this is what I think. And then you read something and it's just so crystal clear and maybe the opposite of what you were thinking. But yeah,
Ah,
okay, this makes
that makes
sense
more
now,
sense. Yeah. Yeah.
you know?
Exactly. Yeah.
So that's something else I mentioned to people a lot is, does it make sense?
Good.
Yeah.
So there's a little dive into reading research. This will probably be one of our least watched podcasts, but we just wanted to get it out there. I mean, I want to get it out there just because I feel like
No, it's
I feel like our industry particularly is not always very well educated on this topic, and so they will like read an article or read a research paper and believe in it like this is the truth. And I just always approach it with a bit of skepticism. Again, does it make to pass a common sense test? What was the methodology they used? Is it
sure.
replicatable? Or more, is it cited in one paper? Is it cited in 500 papers? So other people actually kind of are on board with that. So
Yep.
just, some things to think about as you go forward and try to understand the world and the body a little bit better.
See, for me, I think this podcast or ones like it that explain this, every journalist who's ever written about scientific papers,
Yeah.
every student who's ever
Yes.
written about a scientific paper, I think it is very important to take a look at that, because these seem like common sense to some of us, but to other people, they need to be told. So, and on that note, if you want to reach us, if you want to give us a topic for us to talk about, a little sexier topic maybe, human body wise or movement wise, you can reach us at movingcombos@gmail.com, our social media, Moving Convos on Instagram, Moving Conversations on Facebook. We're posting on those things. I'm trying to post whenever we have something that is movement oriented. I try and post some movement shorts. Be on the lookout for more movement shorts. We're going to be doing even more of those type of things out there. So we're just going to be expanding. I think something that we probably said on our first couple podcasts that I want to reiterate. We are still learning as hosts, and we're now getting better at what we're doing, and we're expanding. And hopefully, if this is what you're liking and you're enjoying it, let us know. We'd really appreciate it. And if there's something you'd like us to cover or like us to do, please let us know, because we're still learning. This game of podcasting, it's a young person's game, and at 53 years old, I feel like I have a lot of catching up to do, but I think we're doing all right. So
Absolutely.
until next week, from Nora St. John, I'm Brian Ritchie. We will see you next time.
Bye, guys.